Yes, my name is Jessamine, and I am a librarian you might know from the internet, and I am at home in Vermont right now. And my sort of funny niche area that I'm really interested in is moss. This cover slide is actually from a talk that I was going to give about 10 years ago when we were talking about hobbies, but then I wound up talking about something else. So this is the talk I've been waiting to give for almost a decade, which is pretty exciting. And because I'm a librarian, this talk comes with a bibliography. And because I'm a good librarian, it comes with a bibliography that is on the internet. So this URL, I know how some people feel about URLs and slides, but this URL is in the chat. And I can actually see the chat going down the side. So if people have like mid-course corrections or anything, feel free to type them in and I'll see them. And they're also on Discord, so you can go check it out there. There's not a lot there, but if you wanted to flip through these slides yourself, if you wanted to learn more about one particular aspect of the things that I'm talking about, well, that's the place to go. And you can hit me up on Twitter at Jessamine, jessamine@gmail.com. I'm the Jessamine most of the places, unless you're looking for the yoga enthusiast. That's a different Jessamine. And so without saying anything else, we'll kind of dive into it. Basically, I am a no pet having librarian. I know that's slightly unusual and no reason for it, just other people have pets, and I used to, in the before times, travel a lot for work. And so that kind of didn't really work out for me. And I can't knit, and I'm not actually super crafty, just I don't know why, just never been. I enjoy the fine art of letter writing, which was my runner-up for this topic. But you know, just thinking about hobbies, that isn't one of mine. And up until recently, I kill plants. So someone would give me a plant, like, oh, you're hosting an event, and somebody's like, here you go, thanks so much for having us. Here's a thing for you to kill. And that was always kind of a bummer, but it made me feel a certain way about myself and my ability to, you know, have things in my home that were sort of green and beautiful. I've gotten a lot better at that, and I wish I knew why. Maybe stopped caring. But in general, at the time when I was looking around for a thing to do, I was a person who killed plants. And so as somebody who is, I think what they call a heavily online person, I think I might say an internet person, my jobs tend to be online. Most of my friends are online. I mean, I live in a town and I have real life friends also, but they go to bed at normal times, unlike myself, who is up late at night. So it's nice to have people where I can chit chat with them, spend a lot of time online in a long distance relationship, chat with my boyfriend online a lot. And I needed an off-screen hobby. And that off-screen hobby needed to have particular characteristics. It needed to be fairly low cost. So golf is out of the question. It needed to be not a lot of effort. So like, you know, model building or something where you're only kind of part way through a thing and then your time is up, wasn't going to work for me. Something that I could squeeze in 15 minutes here, 45 minutes there, something like that, and then have a thing as opposed to part of a thing. Like, I think we all know people who have kind of that part done quilt in the closet. Like when I was a kid growing up, my mother had a part done quilt in the closet, and it always kind of haunted us as like, you know, this is where you're headed. Something I can do at home, because you may have heard of Vermont. We still have winter here, and not only really winter, but like 5 months of winter. Even now in 2020, it's amazing. And so something I could do at home, because that's where I spend a lot of my time. And to be honest, I love my home. Like, it's a little tree house in a little town in Vermont, and I enjoy it here. So I don't necessarily want to go anywhere. At the same time, I, like many people, could use slightly more exercise, right? Like, helps me feel better, helps me sleep better at night. Maybe a thing that would help with that, but that wasn't like going to the gym or weightlifting or something that was just a self-improvement process, because And at the time I was kind of thinking about this. I moved to Vermont for good about, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years ago. And before that, I lived in Seattle. That's where I went to library school at, oh, and it's a judgment-free zone. You just love your single sock, by the way. But basically, I went to the University of Washington library school, got a master's in librarianship, one of the last. And one of the things that I used to like to do there was like kind of go around in the woods. The whole rainforest, which is one of the only temperate rainforests in the continental United States, was near me. We would go there. I went there with my sister one time, and there was this like really simple trail that was called the Hall of Mosses Trail. And like we made jokes about it at the time, right? Like, oh my God, oh, like the most boring trail imaginable. Can you imagine anything? And then we went on this very simple trail, and I believe this next picture, yes, it was like this beautiful, magical fairyland of like just wet, green, growing. It smelled amazing. Right, and this is just a picture from the internet, right? This isn't even my picture. Everybody else, look up the whole rainforest. Oh my God, so cool. And I was like, you know, moss is really maybe a thing that I really like, and maybe I should spend a little bit of time kind of thinking about it. And so like a lot of people, I started kind of poking around doing, you know, research. Like librarians in the room, you remember before 9/11 when there were people who looked things up and that was research, and then there was people who just screwed around on the internet and that was something different. So it's a little weird for me to use that word to mean looking something up on the internet nowadays, but did a little research, learned a little bit of stuff about moss, and also learned that I could do something on a smaller scale. I wouldn't have to plant an entire forest and then wait 5 generations to get something out of it that looked amazing like that. 5 generations, 20 generations, what am I thinking? And so moss became like a question, and like, well, what could I do? What might I be interested in doing? What? And so I looked into it, and, you know, some things you may know, but you may not know. And I'm mentioning it because I didn't know, so I assume other people don't. The study of moss is called bryology. Bryology is actually the study of moss and lichens. And for the purposes of this talk, they're the same, hand wavy, moss, lichen, you know what I mean. But for whatever reason, it was a huge deal in like the mid 1800s. Right? People were super into bryology. You can look up these old periodicals. They're fascinating. People studied moss. I mean, they still do, but they studied it in a way that it was more of kind of a big deal sciencey thing, and less like you're that niche person in the corner that has your tiny interest. And which made me think specifically when this was the niche interests, like, well, this is really your thing. And one of my favorite parts of the whole thing, and when I think about like how I would like to bring this hobby into my older age, was this concept of mosseries. Back before television and other things that would entertain us, people would build these kind of open air porches sort of on the north sides of their home, and then fill them with like rocks and like little nonsense, and then grow moss on them. And they would be these kind of green, cool places that you could hang out, not quite inside, but not quite outside, that were beautiful and smelled wonderful and all the other stuff. And lichen puns are always awesome, right? So you would find guys like Mr. Edward Tuckerman, who was a lichenist, which the jokes write themselves, right? He looks very serious, but he was like the guy for sort of lichen research at the end of the century before the one that ended before this. And the other thing that I think made moss into a timely thing was this was after microscopes, but before sort of people could get around a lot. And so there were these hobbyists that engaged in this thing called postal microscopy, where you would basically mail your microscope slides to other people. This is the UK, by the way. I'm not sure if it's clear. There's a link to this on the list of links, right? Postal microscopy. So like maybe you had a microscope, but you couldn't really like afford or purchase your own slides. And so you would share slides among other microscope enthusiasts and send them around. And many of these things were natural stuff like lichen, moss, spores, all that kind of stuff. There's a couple other things you can do with moss that I learned through this process. You can make this thing called moss jelly, where you take moss. This is out from a book. You basically can strain moss, and it can kind of, you know how like carrageenan, which is the thing in ice cream that makes it sticky, and then people were like, wow, you know, ice cream's got seaweed in it, and you're like, yick, and then it turns out it's actually a delicious part of ice cream. Similarly, mosses have that same gumminess to it, and you can make jelly out of it. Not trying it, not my thing, but interesting, and talks about how wonderful moss is. One of my favorite things that I haven't tried, because again, I live in the woods and there's not really a place to go painting on cement walls, is doing moss graffiti, where you take moss and you put it into your Cuisinart with a medium of some kind, usually buttermilk, and grind it all up and then paint with it, and it will grow, if you do it right, on the thing. Fascinating. If this is your thing, there's an instructable link on how to do it. But for me, the thing that I decided to really learn about is how I keep that green in my house. I don't know if you can tell, there's like a couple behind me on my very busy bookshelf. And that was a terrarium with moss in it, Mossarium. So this is actually very simple to do, so simple that I can tell you in like the next 3 minutes. You need a couple parts, and literally that's it. You don't need to be smart or clever. You don't have to have any particular dexterity, as long as you can open and close a jar. Easy peasy. So first things first, go get some moss. Easier said than done for people who live in the city, but a lot of times you can find it growing on any green space. And the good news about moss is it's kind of a colony plant, so you can take some away and you're not killing it, injuring it, usually harming the organism. It'll just keep growing. It's like more like a fungus than like a plant. Jar with a lid, anything, right? If you're already pickling, think about using one of your pickle jars for your moss. Some rocks. This can be just stuff from an aquarium. This can be rocks from outside, but what you want is kind of a layer that the water can be in, that can kind of touch the above layer, but so the above layer isn't sitting in the water. And these are all pictures of my mossariums, I guess I should mention. And then Spanish moss. It's kind of a joke, right? Like, how do you make your, you know, $2 million? Well, first start with 5 million. It takes moss to get moss, but you can get Spanish moss, or basically anything that's kind of fibrous that you can put between the water layer and your moss layer in order to be able to get a little air in there and a little bit of space, again, so your moss doesn't kind of rot and whatever. And then there's an open discussion on whether activated charcoal, this is the kind of stuff that you would have in a, like an aquarium, but you can also just buy it from the drugstore. Theoretically, it can help keep mold and mildews and little funguses out of your mossarium. The other important thing is, don't get cute and put like little mushrooms or little plants or anything else besides your moss, because moss can basically live like in a terrarium environment without anything more than what's inside it. But if you put something in there that'll decompose, it can turn into kind of a noxious gas situation. And then you'll have this, like, I tried to open my mossarium and instead it exploded in my hands. So don't do that. Activated charcoal can be helpful. If you can't get any, it's not necessary. And literally putting it together is jar, rocks, water, any kind of water, up until about the top of the rocks, Spanish moss on top of that, huck some activated charcoal in if you decide you want to. There's a link, you can read it, see how you feel. And then moss on top of it. And then the most important part, and the hardest thing for people to do, put the lid on it, don't touch it again for several months, because realistically, it just all stays inside its little universe. It doesn't need more air. It doesn't need more water. If you want to, you can add a little bit of water every few months, like a little, like a teaspoon, maybe a tablespoon, not a whole bunch. Don't make it soggy, and it'll stay green, and it'll look amazing, and it'll just stay in your window, even in the wintertime, and look great. You can get creative with your containers. This was probably my favorite one, but it's a nice, easy, cheap, offline, with the exception of this talk, hobby that you can actually have a good time with. Thanks very much for listening to me talk about one of my favorite things. If there's any questions, feel free. Otherwise, I'll be in the Discord and would be happy to chit chat more there.